Thank you very much. In the online world, at the end of the day, when a transaction takes place, payment still needs to take place. Somewhere, somehow, money needs to change hands. But transactions take place in microseconds from thousands of locations by millions of users, and retailers and financial institutions still need to verify the identity and the authenticity. The gentleman here helped make that happen. I want to start talking about exactly how do you do it when 56% of people want same-day delivery and people want single-click checkout. So maybe we'll start with Pat to say, is it possible to meet the needs that seem to be conflicting between instant user experience and a solid verification of authenticity?
Well, I think, number one, the market demands it at the moment.
You're not getting on mic, yeah.
I think the market demands it at the moment. We recently done a survey where, again, it showed a rush towards next day or same day delivery. But obviously that's been staged. And it's been staged to allow manual review. Humans reviewing orders, which is a very silly way of doing business. We think it can be done. We think it can be done with Trustev, obviously. Our customers are e-commerce merchants, and the customers that we supply, which are internet top 100 retailers, are doing it using us.
Okay. And in terms of the way this is done, maybe we'll ask Ron, is it possible to make it a seamless, almost invisible experience that you're verifying who the user is, confirming it's authentic, without making them go through 27 screens, which cause half the shoppers to give up and go elsewhere?
Or to use out-of-band authentication, step-up authentication, which is what we've been doing today through the SMS messages that come to our cell phones. So yes, absolutely. I think the idea of creating or generating a profile on the user having to do with his interaction with the equipment that he's using, be it mobile or tablet or traditional desktop laptop, is very possible. It's a concept called passive biometric. The user is not, in a sense, taken away from his transaction to participate in some type of authentication, but rather the entire process of the session of the transaction development is tracked, is profiled, and in fact is used to determine whether or not it is the same user and a consistent user involved in that account.
So adding more context and awareness to who it is, where it is, how it is happening behind the scenes, unseen, in microseconds to confirm it's valid?
It's a continuous process, right? It's instead of authentication at a gateway, at a single point of entry, where you've been validated, your tag is correct, your credentials are correct. What are you doing beyond that point? What happens once you begin to work inside of that application? What are you doing? And that is, in fact, something that we could do, continuous authentication. Now,
Neil, you're an Irishman who's been based for 20 years in different overseas countries, and you're back here with us this week in Dublin, and you're living in the Nordics, where they've pretty much blazed the trail for paperless transactions. How is that possible without increasing fraud?
What happened in Sweden, the banks just came together and said, hey, there's no competitive advantage in security. In fact, nobody wants this stuff. Why don't we work together, collaborate, and make a seamless platform? And pretty much society's gone cashless. $2 transaction, why should the time be spent figuring out where this key calculator and waiting for an SMS? You want it to happen straight away, as you say. And so, it's about the scale and working together and providing technology like that.
And does this actually work? Maybe, Pat, do you have any experience from whether this adds a cost for the retailer, or can they actually make it a positive for their business if they deploy the technology in the right way?
We remove costs. I think if you were to look at, the bane of all our lives, terrified by Visa, where, merchants have experienced up to 20% drop-off to eliminate fraud. It's like using bouncers in a small country pub. So you can eliminate that. The experience we see is between a 2 to 16% uplift in revenues by eliminating these blockers. People don't want to put in the last 4 digits of their social security. They don't want to email you a picture of their passport. They want the same experience as they have in retail. They walk into a store, they pick something off a shelf, and they leave. Nobody asks them security questions.
Now, Brian Krebs, who writes some very interesting blogs about cybercrime and credit card fraud, came out with an interesting article this week where he said eBay has become the ATM of the underworld, that it's so easy to take a stolen credit card, do an online transaction, ship a goods to somebody, they pay you money, and it's only when the retailer comes after you a month later you realize you've been party to a credit card fraud. Can we do something about that?
So the issue you're talking about is actually very much affecting the operational revenue side of the e-commerce. And it's a concept that I think everybody's probably familiar with called chargebacks. So the question is, how do we reduce chargebacks? And if you start with a working assumption that every credit card being used is in fact fraudulent or stolen, and you start with that working assumption, then the place to focus is on account creation. And as it turns out, when you use behavioral analytics and you start to understand how people interact with applications, you can create two sets of groups. Those who are familiar with the account creation process because they do it often, and those that are not, are less familiar because they're actually legitimate and using that application to create an account with that merchant for the first time. And you have other metrics that you can collect and begin to analyze to create those two sets of groups and highlight for the merchants the guys that are probably more likely to be perpetrating fraud by creating fictitious accounts versus the good guys, like all of us, who are actually engaged with that merchant for legitimate purposes. And by doing so, you can actually help the merchants reduce that chargeback cost, and there's a real value in that.
Now, EMV, or chip and pin as it's more popularly known, is making the physical use of payment cards in store that bit more secure. Does that suggest that the online retailers are going to see even more fraud coming at them because you have to use the CNP, card holder not present technologies?
Not really. What actually happens is they look at the risk profile, what's going on. In the UK, and I believe here as well, you have the touch and go cards. If you're spending 30 euros in the shop, you can just hit the reader and walk away. Because the risk is very low. People buy newspapers, tickets, or whatever. But when somebody buys a larger amount, all of a sudden, hey, I need to see a PIN number. And a real larger amount, it's a PIN number and an ID check. This is what happens across the board. So they just kind of adapt to the risk. So, you know, it's the same with the online one or whatever. If our behavioral analysis can figure out it's the right person with a good sense of it, then you don't need to have this extra second factor of that user convenience. We're trying to get it so it's only the bad people end up having the security problems and the bad user experience.
And what sort of percentage can we get it down to in terms of the number of transactions which have to go for some sort of manual review or an out-of-band verification before we, you know, get that balance right between user experience and security?
After 90 days, we've eliminated it. So we run a lot of ML at repeat customers. But just on the chip and pin piece that you mentioned there, we expect card not present fraud to double in the US next year, because what's happened in Australia, Canada, the minute chip and pin comes in, it practically eliminates retail fraud. And that fraudster, you know, he doesn't get a job driving a taxi. He moves online, and online fraud doubles. So we expect a deluge this year of card not present fraud.
Although, to your point, I think there's a shortage of Uber drivers in Dublin, so maybe he could get a job here in Dublin driving an Uber.
Yeah. Are the institutions, the banks, the issuers, the acquirers somewhat to blame, though, in that they're looking at the cost of some of the new technologies versus the amount they're losing in fraud and deciding which problems are big enough to justify the investment of fixing and which ones they'll just live with, like a retailer with shrinkage, and saying, well, if I've got 16 security guards at the door, customers may not even come in the first place.
Well, here's where you have a real difference between e-commerce on one hand, which is a very low or thin margin business historically and continues to be. And so investment in technology is taken very seriously, but also the loss and the spoilage, as you say, is very significant. In banking, it's slightly different, and there's different philosophies based on geography. So those from the United States understand that in banking in the United States, fraud is a cost of doing business, and an acceptable cost of doing business. In Europe, it's a different focus. They really do want to reduce the fraud in order to give higher degree of confidence and increase the amount of services they're pushing to their users. So it's a philosophical discussion as much as an economic one.
I agree with Ron. We see it, the American banks seem to be very reactive. So they understand there's a level of fraud, and if it starts getting too big, they'll plug that hole with technology and invest in it then. Whereas in Europe, we find, particularly in the Nordics, it's a thought through what's going to happen, what's the cost of doing it. So it's a proactive approach, and so a lot of the holes are filled.
It seems sometimes that in the transaction chain between the customer and the acquirer and the merchant and the bank, the issuer, the responsibility of who has to detect the fraud or who's in a position to versus who carries the cost if it's not detected isn't always fairly split. Is that a problem we're facing?
I think it's all, card not present especially, sits with the merchant. There's no one else has any risk. And that's why, MasterCard, Visa, the schemes, the processors, they don't care because they've no loss in the financial loss. In a retail product that's sold online, the person who sold it bears 100% of the loss. And plus they get a chargeback fee of up to $25, $30 as a further insult. And the card schemes told them to accept the money.
Okay. Now, in the digital world, we have other entities now getting involved in the payments market, and Apple want to become the people who control our digital payments, and Google are looking jealously saying, hey, we want some of the action. Is that going to be the next wave, and will that make things better or just more fragmented?
I don't believe they've got the scale yet. I mean, you're dealing with the schemes and the size of them, and the tiny 1% of it is there. So over time, over years, it'll come out. There'll be different payment methods, but right now, they're barely making a dent in it.
I'm not ready to suggest that the banks are willing to concede to Apple Pay and Google Pay. I think there was an indication last week of some change in the bank community behavior, actually taking an exchange, payment exchange platform, Clear Exchange, and combining it with a company called Early Warning Services that allows a transactional platform to emerge to where the banks can actually share information between themselves and not necessarily cede the market to newer and external players. So I think there is a shift going on in the marketplace in terms of how we're seeing payment systems and how we see the role of the banks, at least in the United States. We'll see where.
I think what you're also going to need, and because I live in the States, I'm using Apple Pay and testing everything. I think what you need is more than the payment. There needs to be some sort of a value add, a gift club card or points or something, because taking out a credit card isn't difficult. It's not a hard thing to pay with a card. It's actually harder to use your phone. You're just so used to it, and there needs to be a complete change in behavior for that, and there's going to need to be value to me for me to make that change in behavior.
You mentioned, Ron, the way that people are trying to collect the information together and they're trying to work together, but the bad guys seem to be even more super organized, because a stolen credit card from one country can be getting used in a fraudulent transaction within an hour, halfway around the world. Are the good guys collaborating enough compared to the speed the bad guys seem to move at?
I think there's room for improvement among the information sharing that is happening in the financial sector and the money world. Not sure that I have great recommendations on where to go with that sharing, but it's absolutely true. The value, there's an interesting stat, I don't know if anybody's here from the healthcare industry, but there was an interesting statistic that came out last month about the value of the health insurance card in the United States versus the credit card, the Visa, MasterCard, American Express. The Visa, MasterCard, American Express has a $5 black market value. The health insurance card has a $50 value. Why? Because the fraud management infrastructure in healthcare is lagging. We're just not there. And so it's much easier to perpetrate fraud against the health insurance carriers, at least, again, US-driven statistics, than it is against the financial sector. And part of that is because in the financial services side, we have been sharing information. We have been doing technology uplift over the years, whereas in other sectors, it's not as active.
I know that in Behaviosec, what you guys can do is to help people understand what's not even a human, what's a bot, or what's a real transaction. How do you do that without impacting the average user so that they don't realize they've just been verified?
At this stage, we would have every single internet bank user in Sweden, Norway, Denmark using stuff, and none of them know about it, besides the papers and the terms and conditions. It's never impacted on their user experience. That's the whole design of the goal. But one of the things with traditional security, is this NEAL. And there's a black and white answer with it. With a biometric, and if it's not NEAL, who is it? And who is it? Is it one of these fraudsters? Is it in this list of blacklisted people who have caused transactions previously in the past? And so that's part of use. And then also, is it too uniform? Is it too perfect? Is it too repeatable? And that's given an indication that there's malware or a bot in the transaction. So the side benefits of the behavior lend us to know whether it's bots, malware, or bad guys.
So you're saying tens of millions of people are being profiled electronically, and the institution can validate that it's them the next time they come back, and that it's zero visibility or impact on the user?
Well, the impact if it's not them, they, hey, now go off and find that calculator that you left somewhere in a drawer, and you might need a new battery for it, by the way, or the transaction's over, So the whole idea is that it's fast. To your initial point, it's like they want it to happen right there and then. And so introducing security to be the extra step to add minutes or even hours to the transaction just doesn't happen.
And Ron?
The impact is actually, am I on? The impact is actually on the positive experience. In other words, today I'm being asked at certain higher risk transaction points through my session to re-authenticate myself. Either, again, through an out-of-band SMS message or even just to re-enter my password that I used to get into the system in the first place. So if I can reduce the amount of times that I engage the user in that additional step up or additional query because I am able to monitor things continuously, then that's an improvement in experience, not a taking away. And I think that's where the banks, in terms of digital online folks, would like to see the industry move, providing greater security, lower risks, but also improved experiences.
Just on that, some of the numbers, but we used to see the average internet bank user would log on about 1.5 times a month. They'd save up their bill stack until payday, and they'd sit at the computer at home and find that smart card and put it in and pay all their bills. Since they moved, and the consumer decides, by the way, when I get onto my internet bank, I can do a smart card, I can do a one-time token, or I can do the mobile app. And the mobile app's secured by all these parameters that we look at, and the consumers are driving straight away. So the average use for internet bank is about 20 times for authentication a month, because they're in all the payments when it happens, micropayments in and out. And it's the user experience is so much more positive to use a mobile and to use this that they're seeing a huge change in behavior.
Okay. Pat, you were quoted in the media, I think it was last year, saying that your preference is never to use a credit card online, that you'll only use a disposable card if you can. Does that mean you don't trust the acquirers, the merchants, the banks, or you're just a super paranoid guy?
I just don't trust the schemes.
Okay.
I've replaced 6 credit cards this year. In America, in retail, it's really difficult because there's no chip and pin yet. It's chip and signature. They went halfways. My card when I eat in a restaurant is taken from my site, so who knows what's going on there. And I think, people forget the actual size of this market. Just in e-commerce fraud, it's somewhere between 10 and 18 billion a year of fraud. So it's a huge number. You have very smart people in this and very smart people making a lot of money.
Can you give any example of the sort of loss being suffered by individual retailers or different sectors, or how much is it taken out of their pockets when they don't get their anti-fraud measures right?
One of our customers is a US mobile retailer. It's difficult naming customers because they ask you not to. When we met them, they were losing 17 million a quarter in handsets. Guys coming into stores with an ID and a social security number, which are about $15 to buy together, and walking out with a $1,000 handset. And, I can walk in with Neil's or I can walk in with Ron's, and I'm out to, there's a guy behind the counter who's on $10 an hour who's expected to be a document checker. And there's no point checking credit for someone who's not the person standing in front of you.
Right.
So we solved that for them using biometrics, using network effect, email verification, mobile location, etc. And if you, it's like a mousetrap. These guys are doing it all the time. If you narrow and narrow and narrow, the route gets smaller.
Okay. So it sounds like sometimes any verification that has a human element is going to fall down when the human element it doesn't do the job right.
We meet, I'm sorry for hogging, we meet everybody we meet who still does large manual review. The final piece in everybody's manual review in e-commerce is they look at the person's house and face in Street View. And it's the exact same, it'll be the same in every mobile retailer in Ireland, every online retailer. If it's flagged for manual review, they'll stick the guy's address into Street View and they'll look at his house. So you're making an educated guess to see if the guy that lives in this house can buy this item.
Well, Ron, Pat doesn't use credit cards online, he uses disposable cards. What scares you? What's your security tip for people in the audience?
So, I think what's happening today is this, as Pat mentioned, very focused and very targeted attack patterns. So it's not that I'm attacking every bank and every customer of every bank at the same time. It's not that there's a broad shotgun approach to fraud. It's a very precise science. There's a lot of educated people sitting behind the screens designing these attacks. And in order to perpetrate the attack, they actually start to unwind the layers of security that have been deployed for Bank X or Bank Y. So they typically work one bank at a time, and they target the customers of that bank. So a common attack that we're seeing today throughout Europe, and to some degree also starting to hit the American shores, is this remote access Trojan, a piece of malware that gets embedded onto specifically the customers of a particular bank that the fraudsters are trying to target. And it won't trigger under normal transaction activity. It's specifically designed to activate when you connect, when you go through the front door of the bank. And this, what we call rat in the browser, you know, we have man in the middle or man in the browser, now we have rat in the browser. This thing allows the person behind the scenes, the fraudster, to continue the session even though we believe we finished our transaction. So where behavioral biometrics comes into factor is that if I'm using the session, have completed the session, but the rat's still on my machine and somebody else has taken over, it's a different profile, it's a different score, it's a different measurement. And we can do that today with the technologies that we have, with the analytics that are, that are available to us, and the science of crunching big data. So we take a lot of input from the device, be it mobile, tablet, desktop, and so forth, and we analyze it. And when the profile shifts, the score, the risk shifts. And so at any time during the transaction, if suddenly there's a add new payee or wire transfer, change telephone number that comes up, the bank doesn't have to ask. It can simply query what the score is.
Well, we're just about out of time, so a last question for Neil maybe, which is that's where we're at today in terms of what the bad guys are doing and what the good guys are doing about it. If you look 5 years forward, what will the electronic fraud look like? What will the bad guys be up to, and how will you guys be stopping it?
Tough question. 5 years out in security, God knows is the answer. But we believe that there's more and more layers being put ahead of them, which then one side of the curve. These technologies that we've brought have shifted it over a little bit, and so it's just that there's no silver bullet, and just keep on researching and innovating and adding new technologies and staying ahead of the bad guys.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.